Picture this. It's Christmas evening, 1899, and you've just arrived at the Vanderbilt mansion on Fifth Avenue for what's being called the most elaborate Christmas dinner of the season. Your carriage pulls up to a house blazing with electric lights, still new enough to feel like magic. And as you step inside, footmen in full livery take your coat, and a butler escorts you to the drawing room where other guests are already gathering. Everyone is dressed in their finest, the women dripping with jewels, the men in white tie and tails, and the conversation is animated with anticipation because everyone has heard rumors about tonight's menu, about the extraordinary lengths the Vanderbilts have gone to, about ingredients shipped from across the world and preparations that have consumed the kitchen staff for weeks. And then you overhear someone mention the cost. Not the cost of a single course or a particular dish, but the cost of this one dinner. You wouldn't believe the number. It's more than a comfortable house in a good neighborhood, more than many families earn in a decade of work, more than some people will see in their entire lifetimes. And this isn't for a week-long celebration or a series of events. This is for one meal, one evening, 12 courses that will be consumed over 5 hours and then be over, leaving nothing behind except the memory of excess so spectacular, it's almost impossible to comprehend. Welcome to the most expensive Christmas dinner of the Gilded Age, where a single evening's meal cost more than a house, where every course represented months of planning and ingredients sourced from across the globe, where the performance of wealth through food reached heights that seemed designed less to satisfy hunger than to demonstrate that money was truly no object. This was dining as theatre, as competition, as a statement that said, we are so wealthy that spending a fortune on food that will be consumed and forgotten in a few hours is nothing to us, barely worth noticing, just what we do at Christmas. Tonight, we're walking through every course of this legendary dinner, what was served, where it came from, what it cost, what it took to prepare, and what it meant to participate in consumption so elaborate that it required armies of servants working around the clock and budgets that exceeded what most Americans earned in years. We'll see what was happening in the kitchen while you sat in the dining room, understand the skill and labor behind each spectacular course, calculate what it all cost both in $1899 and in modern equivalents, and recognize that this dinner, praised at the time as the height of refined entertaining, was actually a performance of wealth so extreme it bordered on obscene. If you're watching with tired eyes and an overthinking mind, this story is for you. If you really enjoy these bedtime journeys through history, please like this video, subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from. I always love knowing where these stories are keeping you company. Let's talk about the Christmas dinner that cost more than a house, the courses that consumed fortunes, and the spectacular excess that the Gilded Age wealthy considered simply appropriate for celebrating the holiday properly. The dinner you're attending tonight at the Vanderbilt mansion is based on documented accounts of the most elaborate Gilded Age Christmas dinners, though the specific details come from multiple sources because these families competed so fiercely over entertaining that each year brought new heights of excess. The Vanderbilts, the Astors, the Goulds, they all hosted spectacular Christmas dinners, but the Vanderbilts were particularly known for sparing no expense, for creating events that set standards other families then tried to match or exceed. You're seated in the formal dining room, a space designed specifically for this kind of entertaining, massive enough to accommodate 20 or 30 guests comfortably, decorated for Christmas with elaborate evergreen arrangements, and what must be thousands of dollars worth of hothouse flowers. It's December, so any flowers are expensive, but the Vanderbilts have entire walls of roses and orchids and lilies, creating a garden in winter through sheer expenditure. The table is set with gold-rimmed china, crystal that catches the light from hundreds of candles in massive silver candelabra, more silverware at each place setting than most families own in total, different forks and knives and spoons for each course, all sterling, all polished to mirror brightness by servants who spent the afternoon on this task alone. You're trying not to calculate what you're looking at. The china service probably costs more than a year's rent, the crystal possibly more than a carriage, the silver flatware representing more wealth than many families accumulate in lifetimes. And this is just the setting before any food has even appeared. The first course arrives, oysters, but not just any oysters. These are Blue Point oysters from Long Island, shipped alive in barrels packed with ice and seaweed, arriving this morning after careful transportation to ensure they stayed fresh. Each guest receives 6 oysters on a special oyster plate, yet another piece of china used only for this purpose, served on beds of crushed ice, accompanied by lemon wedges and multiple sauces, mignonette, cocktail sauce, horseradish cream. You know oysters are expensive. They're always expensive, a luxury item that marks meals as special. But these aren't market oysters. These are premium specimens, hand-selected for size and quality, costing perhaps 50 cents each when a skilled worker earns $2 for a full day's labor. 6 oysters per guest, 30 guests. That's $90 just for the oysters, equivalent to about $3,000 today for the first course alone, for shellfish that will be consumed in minutes. Behind the scenes in the kitchen, the oyster course required a servant who spent hours this afternoon shucking oysters, opening each shell carefully without damaging the delicate meat inside, arranging them on plates with ice, and preparing the accompaniments. His hands are cut and sore from oyster shells. He's been working since dawn, and he'll work until after midnight, earning perhaps $30 per month while serving a single course that costs 3 times his monthly wages. The oyster plates are cleared by footmen who move in synchronized silence, and you notice how they're dressed. Full livery with white gloves, selected partly for their height and appearance because wealthy families wanted servants who looked impressive. The footmen have been on duty since early afternoon, will work until well after midnight, and are probably thinking about their own Christmas plans which have been postponed or cancelled because serving this dinner took priority over their personal lives. The second course is soup. But calling it soup is almost insulting given what appears. This is a clear consommé made from beef that has been simmered and reduced and clarified for days to achieve perfect transparency and intense flavour. Making proper consommé is genuinely difficult, requiring skill and patience and enormous quantities of beef for relatively small amounts of finished soup. The beef used to make this consommé, premium cuts, carefully trimmed, cost more than the meat many families eat in weeks, and most of it was used just to create flavour that was then strained out and discarded. The consommé is served in delicate bowls with gold rims, piping hot, garnished with tiny vegetables cut into perfect shapes, carrots and celery carved into decorative forms, by a servant whose job today was literally just cutting vegetables into stars and flowers and other designs because apparently vegetables in their natural shapes aren't fancy enough for this dinner. The cutting took hours, generated enormous waste. The irregular trimmings were discarded or used for servants' meals, and was done by someone earning perhaps $25 per month while preparing a garnish that costs more than his weekly wages. You taste the consommé, it's delicious, intensely flavoured, perfectly clear, and you think about how much labour went into this one small bowl of soup. The modern equivalent would be like an influencer spending thousands of dollars on a single story post, on content that will be viewed briefly and then vanish, except at least digital content can be saved and rewatched. This soup will be consumed in minutes and exist only as memory, and if anyone is gauche enough to discuss it, as gossip about the Vanderbilt's magnificent entertaining. The fish course arrives next, and it's not simple fish. It's whole poached salmon, brought to the table on massive silver platters, the fish perfectly cooked and decorated to look like it's swimming through a sea of aspic and cucumber scales and lemon flowers. These salmon weren't caught locally. They were shipped from Scotland, packed in ice, transported by ship and then by rail, arriving fresh enough to be served at the finest dinner of the season. A single Scottish salmon in December 1899, shipped to New York fresh, probably cost $15 to $20s, equivalent to maybe $600 today, and the Vanderbilts are serving 3 or 4 of them to ensure everyone gets generous portions. That's $80 just for the fish, before considering the butter sauce that accompanies it, made from expensive French butter, the vegetables, out of season, grown in hothouses or shipped from warmer climates, the labour to poach the fish perfectly and create the elaborate decorative presentation. In the kitchen, the fish course required a cook who specialised in fish preparation. Poaching salmon perfectly so it's cooked through but still moist is genuinely difficult, requiring precise temperature control and timing. The cook has been monitoring these salmon for the past hour, checking temperature, adjusting heat, ensuring perfection, because if the fish is overcooked or undercooked, it will be noticed and criticized, and he might lose his position over it. He's probably earning $40 to $50 per month, considered good wages for skilled kitchen work, while preparing fish that costs half his monthly salary. The table conversation continues around you. People are complimenting the meal, discussing social news, being carefully charming and witty, because dining at the Vanderbilts means you're performing too, demonstrating you're sophisticated enough to belong here, that you know how to appreciate this kind of entertainment. Someone mentions that the Astor's Christmas dinner last year included caviar from Russia, and you can almost see Mrs. Vanderbilt make a mental note. Next year, there will be caviar, probably more caviar than the Astors served, because that's how this works. It's not enough to entertain lavishly. You have to exceed what other families have done, always escalating, always more. The fourth course is an entree in the French style, which confusingly doesn't mean the main course but rather an intermediate course between fish and meat. Tonight it's quail, not 1 or 2 quail, but 12 of them, each stuffed with foie gras and truffles, roasted until the skin is crispy and golden, served on small toast rounds with a rich wine sauce. Quail are expensive game birds, even in an era when game is more available than it will be later. These aren't local quail. They're from estates in upstate New York, or possibly imported from Europe, carefully raised and fattened, costing perhaps $2 per bird. 12 quail at $2 each is 24, about $800 today, for a single intermediate course, for birds that most guests will eat 1 or maybe 2 of before moving on to the next course. The foie gras stuffing costs more than the quail. Foie gras is always expensive, a luxury ingredient that in the 1890s had to be imported from France, costing several dollars per pound. The truffles are even more expensive, imported from France or Italy, costing $10 to $15 per pound, more than a week's wages for most workers. And the Vanderbilts are using them in stuffing that will be largely invisible once the quail are cooked, using luxury ingredients where they'll barely be noticed because the point is excess, not practicality. The kitchen work for this course was intense. Each quail had to be individually cleaned, stuffed, trussed, and roasted, requiring skills that took years to develop and hands that were sore from handling hot pans and sharp knives. The cook responsible for the quail has been working on them for hours, probably starting this afternoon to ensure they'd be perfectly timed for service, and he'll move immediately to the next course after these are served because there's no rest during dinner service, just constant preparation and cooking and plating. You notice the wine being poured with each course. Different wines carefully selected to complement each dish, all from impressive vintages, all from the Vanderbilt's extensive cellar. The wine alone probably costs more than many families spend on food for months. Champagne with the oysters, French champagne obviously, probably Moet or similar prestigious houses. White Burgundy with the fish, red Burgundy with the quail. The wines are served in appropriate glasses, yet more crystal, yet more evidence of wealth measured in things most people will never own. The main course, the releve, arrives with appropriate ceremony. This is roast beef, but not ordinary roast beef. This is a standing rib roast of prime beef that has been aged for weeks to develop intense flavour and tender texture, the kind of beef that costs several dollars per pound when ordinary beef costs 20 cents. The roast is enormous, carved at table by the butler, a skilled performance in itself. Each guest receiving thick slices that are pink and juicy and perfect. Accompanying the beef are multiple side dishes. Potatoes prepared 3 different ways, mashed with butter and cream, roasted with herbs, made into elaborate potato croquettes that required a servant to hand shape and bread and fry dozens of small portions. Brussels sprouts roasted with chestnuts that had to be individually peeled, a tedious task taking hours. Glazed carrots, creamed onions, Yorkshire pudding made from scratch. Each side dish represents separate preparation, separate cooking, separate labour. The beef alone probably costs $30 to $40, maybe $100-200 today, for a roast large enough to serve 30 guests generously. The sides add another $20 or so in ingredients. The labour is uncounted but substantial. Multiple servants worked on these sides simultaneously, timing them to finish together, ensuring everything was hot and perfect when service began. You're starting to feel full. You've had oysters and soup and salmon and quail, and now substantial portions of beef and multiple sides. But you know from the menu that there are still 6 more courses. This is less than halfway through. The modern equivalent would be like those elaborate tasting menus at high-end restaurants that take 4 hours and cost several $100s per person. Except multiply that by 10 and add the pressure of social performance and the awareness that you're participating in consumption that could feed families for months. After the beef comes a palate cleanser, Roman punch, a frozen mixture of champagne, rum, and lemon ice, served in small crystal cups, meant to refresh your taste buds before the next round of courses. Roman punch seems like a minor course, but it's actually expensive to produce. It requires ice, which in 1899 means either ice cut from frozen lakes and stored in ice houses, or ice made in early refrigeration units, both expensive. Good champagne, they're not using cheap sparkling wine for this. Quality rum, fresh lemons in December. The ingredients for this small course probably cost $15, about $500 today, for something that's consumed in 3 or 4 bites. The servants clearing plates and serving the Roman punch have been on their feet for hours now, moving constantly between the dining room and kitchen, carrying heavy platters and trays, maintaining perfect posture and pleasant expressions, becoming essentially invisible despite performing constantly. Their feet hurt, their backs ache, they're probably hungry. They ate a quick meal before service, but that was hours ago and won't eat again until after midnight. And they're thinking about the hours of work still ahead. Service will continue for several more hours, then there's clean-up and then set-up for tomorrow's breakfast. The next course is a game. Roasted duck, 2 whole ducks carved and plated beautifully, served with an orange sauce that required a cook to reduce orange juice and stock and cognac for hours to achieve the right consistency and flavour. Duck is expensive poultry, more so than chicken or turkey, and serving it whole rather than portioned out further emphasises luxury and abundance. These ducks probably cost $3 each, about $100 today, plus the ingredients for the sauce, plus the labour. With the duck comes a salad course. Not before the meal, as modern Americans eat salad, but after the main meats, serving as another palate cleanser. The salad is delicate lettuce that had to be grown in hothouses in December, dressed with a minimal vinaigrette made from expensive French vinegar and imported olive oil, served with cheese if guests desire. The lettuces probably cost several dollars per pound, absurdly expensive for greens that are mostly water, because growing them in December requires heated greenhouses, careful cultivation, resources that would never be expended if the Vanderbilts weren't willing to pay whatever it costs to have fresh salad in winter. You notice one of the other guests making a subtle grimace when she thinks no one is watching. Maybe she's as full as you are. Maybe she's thinking about how excessive this is. Maybe she's doing the mental math on what all of this costs and coming to conclusions about whether this is impressive or appalling or both. But she recovers quickly, returning to pleasant conversation, because showing any discomfort with excess would be social suicide. The whole point of being invited to dinners like this is that you're sophisticated enough to find this normal, to act as though consuming a fortune in a single evening is perfectly reasonable behavior for wealthy people during the holidays. Dessert arrives, but it's not one dessert. It's 8 different options presented simultaneously on the table and on sideboards, creating a spectacle of sugar and luxury. There's plum pudding, flaming with brandy as it's brought to the table. The brandy itself costs several dollars per bottle, and they're using it to set dessert on fire for dramatic effect. There's mince pie made with ingredients including actual minced meat, expensive cuts, finely chopped, mixed with dried fruits and spices that came from across the world. There's baked Alaska, a technical marvel of ice cream encased in cake and covered with meringue, briefly baked so the meringue browns while the ice cream stays frozen, demonstrating the kitchen's sophistication and the availability of reliable freezing equipment. There are elaborate cakes, genoise layered with buttercream and jam, decorated with spun sugar and marzipan shaped into Christmas scenes. There's ice cream molded into architectural forms, miniature palaces and monuments, created by servants who spent hours filling molds with different colored ice creams, freezing them solid, unmolding them into shapes that will be admired briefly and then eaten. There are bonbons and glacéed fruits and candied nuts and basically every sweet thing imaginable, all presented beautifully, all representing hours of preparation and expensive ingredients. The cost of this dessert course alone probably exceeds $50, nearly $2,000 today, for sugar work that will be consumed in minutes, for ice cream that required constant churning by hand and careful molding, for decorations made from marzipan that cost several dollars per pound. And that was shaped by servants whose artistic skills are being used to create temporary food art. In the kitchen, the pastry chef who created these desserts has been working for 2 days straight. The cakes had to be baked yesterday, the ice cream molded early this morning, the plum pudding made weeks ago and aged. He's exhausted, probably hasn't slept more than 4 or 5 hours in the past 2 days, and he'll spend several more hours after the dinner cleaning his station and preparing for tomorrow's meals. He's probably earning $60 per month, considered excellent wages for a skilled pastry chef, while creating desserts that cost nearly his monthly salary for a single course at a single dinner. The final course is coffee and liqueurs, served in the drawing room after everyone retires from the dining room. The coffee is expensive imported coffee from Brazil or Colombia, prepared in silver coffee service, yet more silver, representing yet more wealth just sitting on sideboards. The liqueurs are French cognac, Italian amaretto, various cordials, all costly imports, all served in tiny crystal glasses, all representing further expense for alcohol that will be consumed in small amounts by guests who are almost certainly too full to really want more of anything, but who will politely sip. Because that's what you do at dinners like this. Servants are still working, clearing the dining room, washing the hundreds of pieces of china and crystal and silver used during the meal, preparing the drawing room for after-dinner entertainment, attending to any guest needs. The scullery maids are washing dishes in the kitchen, standing at deep sinks filled with hot water, scrubbing plates and pots and serving dishes, knowing they won't finish until well after midnight, knowing they'll be up again at 5 or 6 to begin preparations for breakfast. You finally leave around 11 o'clock, 5 hours after you arrived, having consumed 12 courses and drunk 4 or 5 different wines and eaten enough food to sustain you for days. You're driven home in your carriage, probably feeling uncomfortably full, possibly thinking about how spectacular the evening was, possibly wondering if maybe this was all a bit much even by the standards you're accustomed to. The total cost of this dinner, conservatively estimated based on documented accounts and prices from the period, was probably somewhere between $800 and $1,200 in $1899. That's equivalent to roughly $28,000 to $42,000 today for one evening's meal, for food that was consumed in 5 hours and left nothing permanent behind, except perhaps some indigestion and a lot of gossip about how spectacular the Vanderbilt's entertaining continues to be. To put that in perspective with house prices, in 1899, you could buy a comfortable middle-class house in a good neighborhood in many American cities for $2,000 to $3,000. This dinner cost between a quarter and half the price of a house. In modern terms, it's like spending $100,000 to $150,000 on a single dinner party. The price of a luxury car or a down payment on a house in many markets, spent on food that will be gone in a few hours. Compared to worker salaries, a skilled worker in 1899 might earn $500 to $700 per year. This dinner cost more than a year's wages for most working Americans, more than a working family might spend on food for their entire household for 5 or 10 years. In the modern equivalent, it's like spending $60,000 on one meal, when that's someone's entire annual salary. The environmental and social costs are harder to calculate but real. The dinner required ingredients from across the world: oysters from Long Island, salmon from Scotland, truffles from France, caviar from Russia, wines from Europe, exotic fruits from tropical climates. Each item represented transportation costs, resource extraction, labor in far-off places. The oyster beds were being depleted from overharvesting to supply wealthy tables. The salmon populations were declining. The environmental costs weren't counted or considered because that wasn't how people thought in the 1890s. The social cost was the stark inequality on display. Servants working 18-hour days earning maybe $30 per month while serving courses that cost hundreds of dollars. families struggling to afford basic necessities, while the Vanderbilts spent more on one dinner than those families would see in years. The dinner was a performance of wealth that reinforced hierarchies, that demonstrated the vast gulf between the extremely wealthy and everyone else, that treated consumption of this magnitude as normal and appropriate and even admirable. Modern comparison. Think about celebrity or influencer dinner parties that make news for their excess. Maybe a $10,000 sushi dinner, or a birthday party that cost $50,000, or a wedding reception with $100,000 in flowers. Those seem extravagant, and people criticize them as wasteful or out of touch. This Gilded Age Christmas dinner was worse, proportionally more expensive relative to average incomes, involving even more extreme inequality between hosts and workers, creating even starker contrasts between the haves and have-nots. Or think about it like this. Imagine someone today spending $150,000 on a single dinner party, sourcing ingredients from across the world regardless of environmental cost, employing dozens of workers at minimum wage to prepare and serve everything, and then hosting this dinner not as a once-in-a-lifetime event, but as an annual tradition, something they did every Christmas, as a matter of course. The public response would be intensely critical, calling it wasteful, obscene, tone-deaf, evidence of grotesque inequality. Yet Gilded Age society celebrated these dinners, wrote about them admiringly in newspapers, treated them as evidence of refined taste and proper entertaining, rather than as evidence of consumption that had become fundamentally disconnected from any sense of proportion or social responsibility. The Vanderbilt family hosting this dinner probably didn't think they were doing anything wrong. From their perspective, they were celebrating Christmas appropriately for people of their wealth and status, maintaining standards of entertaining that they'd been raised to consider normal, employing servants, providing jobs, supporting various industries from oyster fishing to wine production. They would have been genuinely confused by suggestions that spending this much on dinner was excessive or inappropriate. This was simply what people like them did, what their social position required, what tradition demanded. But looking back from our modern perspective, the excess is stunning. Not just the amount of money spent, though that's remarkable enough, but the casualness with which it was spent, the assumption that this was normal and appropriate, the complete disconnect between the cost of this dinner and the economic reality most Americans lived in, the fact that someone could spend more than a house on a single meal, could employ dozens of servants to make it happen, could source ingredients from across the world, and have this be considered not scandalous, but admirable, that reveals something about Gilded Age wealth and values that's simultaneously fascinating and disturbing. The servants who made this dinner possible, the cook who simmered consommé for days, the pastry chef who spent 2 days creating elaborate desserts, the scullery maids who washed hundreds of dishes, the footmen who served for 5 hours while remaining invisible, all of them working themselves to exhaustion for wages that were a fraction of what single courses cost. They made it look effortless because that was their job. The whole performance required that the labor be hidden, that guests not think about the dozen people working behind the scenes to produce each course, that the dinner appear to simply happen through some combination of good taste and appropriate expenditure. When you left that dinner, full and slightly overwhelmed, you probably felt you'd participated in something special, something that demonstrated sophistication and culture and refined celebration. You might have admired the Vanderbilts' taste, their ability to source such perfect ingredients, and their commitment to entertaining at the highest levels. You probably didn't think much about the servants still working hours after you left, or about the family whose annual income was less than the cost of that one meal, or about whether maybe spending more than a house on dinner was taking the celebration of Christmas to extremes that had less to do with holiday spirit and more to do with competitive displays. The Gilded Age Christmas dinner that cost more than a house was impressive, certainly. The technical skill required to produce it, the logistics of sourcing ingredients from across the world in an era before reliable refrigeration or rapid transportation, the sheer ambition of creating something so elaborate. But it was also evidence of wealth and inequality that had reached levels that were fundamentally problematic, that created systems where some people could spend fortunes on temporary pleasures, while others worked themselves to exhaustion for wages that wouldn't cover a single course. When you think about Gilded Age excess, when you imagine what it meant to be that wealthy, This dinner is a perfect example. Spectacular, impressive, technically remarkable, and also deeply troubling in what it represented about who had resources and who didn't, about what was considered appropriate celebration versus what was actually gross excess dressed up as refined entertaining. It was a dinner that cost more than a house, created by people earning less in months than single courses cost, served to people who found this normal and appropriate rather than excessive or obscene. The legacy of dinners like this is the modern luxury dining industry. The idea that food can be art and experience and performance, that meals can be elaborate multi-course affairs designed to impress and delight. But we've mostly lost the casual acceptance of the kind of extreme inequality these dinners represented. When modern restaurants charge hundreds or thousands of dollars for elaborate tasting menus, at least the people preparing and serving are being paid professional wages rather than poverty wages. At least there's some sense that maybe spending a fortune on temporary consumption should be questioned rather than celebrated. The Gilded Age Christmas dinner that cost more than a house stands as both an impressive achievement in entertaining and a cautionary tale about what happens when wealth and status competition combine with no sense of limits or social responsibility. It was magnificent, and it was obscene, often simultaneously, a perfect crystallization of an era when having more money than most people could imagine didn't come with any expectation that you'd use it responsibly, or consider whether maybe there were better uses for resources than setting desserts on fire for dramatic effect.